In my line of work, I have interviewed people who billed Medicare for surgeries they never performed. I have traced shell companies that laundered pharmaceutical kickbacks through offshore accounts in 3 different countries. I have built federal cases against hospital administrators who ran fake cancer treatment protocols just to collect insurance reimbursements from dying patients who trusted them completely. I have seen every shape and size of medical fraud. I thought I was immune to being surprised by the depths of human greed. My name is Maya. I am a senior investigator with the Office of Inspector General, Department of Health and Human Services. In simpler terms, I am a federal medical fraud investigator. I spend my days building airtight cases against people who steal from the sick, the desperate, and the dying. My older sister's name is Serena. For most of our adult lives, Serena and I existed in separate worlds. I had chosen a rigid, demanding career built on evidence and law. She had spent her 20s pursuing a career in acting, commercial auditions, small theater productions, and a handful of minor, uncredited appearances in low-budget films. She was charming, deeply persuasive, and had a genuinely remarkable talent for becoming whatever the moment required her to be. She just couldn't book a steady job. By the time Serena was 32, the acting career had quietly collapsed. She was waitressing at a restaurant 3 days a week and burning through her savings. Our parents worried about her constantly. Our mother called me every other week, asking me to check in on Serena, to be a better sister, to be less cold and more supportive. I tried. But Serena and I had always rubbed each other raw. She thought I was rigid and bloodless. I thought she was manipulative and dramatic. We were both at least partially correct. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in early spring. I was at my desk, reviewing a set of fraudulent billing records, when Serena's name lit up my screen. I almost didn't answer. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 months. Maya. Her voice was quiet and unsteady in a way I had never heard before. Not theatrical, just quiet. I need to tell you something. She told me she had been diagnosed with stage 3 acute myeloid leukemia, blood cancer. She told me she had been hiding the diagnosis from the family for 2 months because she didn't want to worry anyone. She told me the prognosis was serious but not hopeless. She told me the treatment was going to be brutal and astronomically expensive, and that her health insurance had a cap that wouldn't cover even half of the projected costs. I sat at my desk and said all the things a person is supposed to say. I told her I was sorry. I told her I loved her. I told her we would figure it out together. I was a good actress myself in that moment, because even as I was saying those words, a small, cold, deeply professional part of my brain had already opened a new file. Something was wrong. I couldn't articulate it yet. It was just a feeling. The same low-frequency alarm that fires in the back of my skull when I'm reading a fraudulent invoice and something in the numbers is slightly off. Nothing dramatic, just a single, quiet note of dissonance. I flew home the following weekend to see Serena. She met me at the door of her apartment. She was wearing a loose knit beanie pulled low over her head. Her face was pale. She moved slowly. She was thin. She looked like what a person with cancer is supposed to look like. She showed me a framed photograph sitting on her kitchen counter. Her and her oncologist, a silver-haired man in a white coat, smiling in what appeared to be a clinic hallway. She showed me a stack of medical documents, lab reports, a treatment schedule, a letter of diagnosis from Dr. Raymond Holloway, MD, Oncology Associates of the Pacific Northwest. I sat across from her and listened to her describe the fear of her first round of chemotherapy. I listened to her describe the nausea, the hair loss, the bone pain. I held her hand, and I said nothing about the things I noticed. I noticed that the medical documents were printed on standard copy paper rather than the heavy, watermarked letterhead that every legitimate hospital system uses for patient records. I noticed that the letter from Dr. Holloway did not include a national provider identifier number. a unique 10-digit federal ID that every licensed physician in the United States is legally required to use on all official correspondence. I noticed that the lab reports had the header of a legitimate regional hospital, but the font spacing on the test results was slightly inconsistent with the rest of the document. I also noticed that Serena's eyebrows were perfectly, meticulously shaped. People undergoing active chemotherapy for acute myeloid leukemia don't typically have the energy or the desire to do their eyebrows. They usually lose them. I flew back home. That Sunday evening, 1 week later, GoFundMe appeared. Serena's campaign was titled, "Fighting for My Life. Help Serena Beat Stage 3 Leukemia." Her opening paragraph was genuinely moving. I recognized the cadence and the emotional structure from certain monologues I had heard her rehearse years ago. She had crafted it carefully. The campaign featured a video of Serena, her head freshly shaved, sitting in a soft chair near a window. She spoke directly into the camera about fear, about faith, about the unbearable cost of fighting for her life. She was crying, not the ugly, uncontrolled crying of someone genuinely terrified. It was the kind of precise, photogenic crying that an actor produces intentionally. I knew this because I had watched Serena cry for real exactly once, when our father was in the hospital years ago. It looked nothing like the video. Within 48 hours, the GoFundMe had raised $80,000. Within 2 weeks, it had passed $200,000. Within 6 weeks, the final total sat at $412,000, donated by hundreds of people. Neighbor, old school friends, strangers moved by the algorithm, who had opened their hearts and their wallets for my sister's battle. Our parents donated $30,000 of their retirement savings. I sat in my apartment and watched the campaign's donation counter tick upward, and the professional part of my brain, the part that had built federal fraud cases for 11 years, quietly, methodically began to work. I did not confront Serena, a medical fraud investigator. Who confronts a suspect before building an airtight evidence file is just a person picking a fight. They get denied, they get lawyers thrown at them, and the suspect gets time to destroy the evidence and disappear. I had to be patient. I had to be thorough. And I had to be willing to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of where it ended. The very first thing I did was run a search on Dr. Raymond Holloway, MD, Oncology Associates of the Pacific Northwest, through the Federal National Provider Identifier Database. The NPI registry is a federal database containing every single licensed physician practicing medicine in the United States. It contains over 6 million entries. There is no way for a legitimate, practicing oncologist to be absent from this database. Dr. Raymond Holloway did not exist in the registry, not in any state, not under any variation of the name. I sat back in my desk chair and breathed slowly. The note of dissonance from my first visit home had just become a full, blaring, undeniable alarm. My sister had not been diagnosed with leukemia. My sister had fabricated a terminal illness, created fraudulent medical documents, shaved her own head, and raised $400,000 from grieving, generous, trusting people. She had stolen $30,000 of our parents' retirement fund with a lie about dying, and she wasn't done. 3 months after the GoFundMe closed, Serena announced on her social media channels that she had chosen to pursue integrative and holistic oncological care, rather than continue with the toxic conventional treatments that were damaging her body. She announced that she was pouring her recovery journey into a new wellness center she was opening called Harmony Wellness. The business registration documents were publicly available through the state commercial registry. I pulled them up. Harmony Wellness LLC was capitalized with a $300,000 initial investment. The source of the funds was a series of wire transfers from 4 different personal accounts, all registered to Serena. The GoFundMe donations, less whatever she had spent on the shaved head and the photo shoot, had been laundered into a business. I opened my case file and labeled it with a single clinical header: Rossi, Serena, Federal Medical Fraud, Case File 001. I had built dozens of cases like this. None of them had been personal before. I took a slow breath. I closed the case file, and then I opened it again, because this was my job. This was what I did. And no one, not my sister, not my parents, not the $400,000 of stolen grief money, was going to make me stop doing it right. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over me when I begin building a fraud case. It is the silence of absolute clinical focus. Every personal feeling, every flash of grief, every impulse towards sisterly loyalty, every memory of childhood gets methodically filed away in a compartment I do not open during working hours. I became a machine. The case against Serena had 3 separate tracks that needed to be investigated simultaneously: the medical fraud, the financial fraud, and the product fraud at Harmony Wellness. Each track required a different set of tools, a different database, and a different legal framework. I started with the medical records, because forged medical records are the foundation of the entire lie. Without them, the GoFundMe collapses, the business has no legitimacy, and the entire narrative falls apart. I already knew that Dr. Raymond Holloway didn't exist in the federal NPI registry, but I needed to go deeper. I needed to prove, beyond any legal doubt, that Serena had never been treated at any legitimate medical facility for any form of leukemia. In the United States, patient medical records are protected by HIPAA. I could not subpoena them without a formal federal investigation being opened. But I could do something almost as powerful. I could look at what records didn't exist. Acute myeloid leukemia, the specific cancer Serena had claimed, has a very distinct and well-documented paper trail in the healthcare system. A patient diagnosed with stage 3 AML will generate records across multiple systems simultaneously. Insurance pre-authorization requests, lab processing invoices from clinical pathology labs, and pharmacy benefit manager records for the specific, highly expensive chemotherapy drugs used in treatment. I pulled Serena's insurance records through the federal, Medicaid, and Medicare databases. She had low-income health care coverage. I searched for any pre-authorization requests, any claims, any reimbursement filings associated with her name, her social security number, and the diagnosis codes for acute myeloid leukemia. There were none. Not a single claim, not a single pre-authorization, not a single pharmacy reimbursement. A woman fighting stage 3 leukemia without generating a single insurance claim is a medical impossibility. The drugs required to treat AML cost between $5,000 and $15,000 per infusion cycle. Even if Serena had chosen to pay out of pocket for everything, the laboratory fees alone, the blood tests, the bone marrow biopsies, the PET scans, would have created records in the National Pathology Lab Network. I searched the 3 largest commercial pathology lab networks in the country for any records linked to Serena's information. Nothing. Serena Rossi had never been tested, treated, or diagnosed with leukemia at any legitimate facility in the United States. The illness was entirely fabricated. I documented every search, every negative result, every database query. I created a precise, timestamped audit trail proving the complete absence of any legitimate medical record. In a fraud case, the absence of evidence is evidence of fraud. Track 1 was complete. I moved to the financial investigation. The GoFundMe platform, like all crowdfunding platforms, is subject to federal financial regulations. Donations made to a fraudulent campaign constitute wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1343, a federal felony that carries a maximum sentence of 20 years per count. Every single donation made over the internet is a separate count of wire fraud. With $412,000 raised from hundreds of individual donors, Serena was looking at potentially hundreds of counts of wire fraud. I subpoenaed Serena's banking records through the internal channels available to federal investigators in the OIG. I didn't need a court order at this stage. I was building the preliminary evidence package to present to the FBI before requesting formal warrants. I was using legally available financial disclosure mechanisms that apply to ongoing fraud investigations. The money trail was breathtaking in its arrogance. Serena had not even attempted to obscure the movement of the funds. The GoFundMe donations had been wired directly into a personal checking account in her name. From there, she had moved the money through a simple three-step process. First, she wired $300,000 into the startup capital account for Harmony Wellness LLC. Second, she paid herself a monthly management salary of $12,000 from the business account, 60% higher than what she had ever earned waitressing. Third, she used the personal checking account to pay for a series of deeply personal expenses. A new SUV, a luxury apartment deposit, high-end clothing, and a series of wellness spa retreats. She had stolen $400,000 from grieving donors and used it to dramatically upgrade her lifestyle without a single moment of hesitation. I documented every transaction with its corresponding federal statute violation. The financial picture was crystal clear and utterly devastating. Track 2 was complete. Track 3 was the most technically complex. Harmony Wellness. The clinic's website was a masterpiece of wellness industry jargon. It offered integrative oncological support, cellular detoxification therapy, and quantum resonance healing protocols. It sold 3-tiered treatment packages, ranging from $2,000 per month for the foundation healing journey, all the way up to $8,000 per month for the flagship complete cellular regeneration program. The marketing copy was aggressive and specific. It featured testimonials, likely fabricated, from patients claiming that the clinic's proprietary herbal and mineral compound injections had achieved remission in cases where conventional medicine had failed. Selling a fake cancer cure is not just consumer fraud. It is one of the most morally reprehensible crimes in the medical fraud spectrum. Desperate, terminally ill patients, people who had exhausted every legitimate option, were spending their final savings on injections of what the website vaguely described as proprietary bioactive cellular compounds. I needed to know exactly what was in those injections. I couldn't walk into Harmony Wellness and ask for a sample. But I didn't need to. Serena's clinic had been operating for 4 months and was already generating significant revenue. With that level of volume, they had to be purchasing their supplies from a commercial vendor. I searched the Oregon Business Registry for Harmony Wellness's registered supplier relationships. I found that Harmony Wellness had a supply contract with a company called Pacific Botanical Compounding LLC. I ran Pacific Botanical through the FDA's Establishment Registration Database. They were a registered dietary supplement manufacturer, not a pharmaceutical company. They were legally authorized to produce herbal extracts and nutritional supplements for general wellness use. They were absolutely not authorized to produce anything described or marketed as a cancer treatment. Through a legitimate FDA inspection request that I filed using my federal credentials, I obtained a copy of Pacific Botanical's recent batch production records. I cross-referenced the batch numbers against Harmony Wellness's inventory invoices, which I had obtained through the financial investigation. Then I sent the batch records to a forensic pharmaceutical chemist named Dr. Park, who I had worked with on 3 previous cases. I sent him the records along with a very simple question: what is actually in this? Dr. Park's report came back in 10 days. I read it at my kitchen table at 11 p.m., my cold tea sitting untouched beside my laptop. The complete cellular regeneration compound being injected into cancer patients at Harmony Wellness for $8,000 per month consisted of the following ingredients: pharmaceutical-grade saline solution, glucose, a proprietary blend of commercially available herbal extracts, including chamomile and peppermint, trace amounts of zinc and magnesium, and a small quantity of pharmaceutical-grade B12 vitamins. Total raw material cost per injection, at commercial wholesale prices, approximately $47. Serena was injecting dying cancer patients with glorified saline water, chamomile tea, and a vitamin shot. She was charging them $8,000 a month, telling them it was rebuilding their cellular structure at the quantum level and generating revenue of potentially over $100,000 per month. I closed Dr. Park's report. I stood up from my kitchen table and walked to the window. I stood there for a very long time, staring out at the dark street below. This was the moment in every fraud case when the professional distance I maintained began to have a weight. It was never the money that got to me. It was the victims. The people sitting in Harmony Wellness's pristine, carefully designed treatment rooms, being injected with expensive salt water, believing desperately, completely believing, that they were fighting for their lives. These were people who had been failed by conventional medicine. These were people in their most terrifying, most desperate moments. And my sister was in a back office, cashing their checks. I went back to my kitchen table. I opened the case file. Track 3 was complete. The evidence package was essentially finished. I had documented the fraudulent medical credentials, the complete absence of legitimate medical records, the wire fraud money trail, and the fraudulent product marketing. But I was not ready to hand it to the FBI yet. There was one more piece of information I needed. The piece that would transform a significant fraud case into an absolutely bulletproof, career-defining federal prosecution. I needed Serena's actual medical records, the real ones. The records that would prove, with clinical certainty, that she had walked into a hair salon, paid for a head shave, and then walked into a GoFundMe campaign as a dying woman. To get those records, I was going to have to get a lot closer to Harmony Wellness than I was comfortable with, and Serena was going to have to believe I was on her side. Getting close to Serena required a performance of my own. I called her on a Friday afternoon. I used a voice I hadn't deployed in years, warm, slightly uncertain, the voice of a younger sister who had finally set aside her professional armor. "Serena," I said, "I've been thinking about you constantly. I've been terrible at this, haven't I? Being a real sister, I want to do better. Can I come visit? I want to see the clinic. I want to understand what you're building." There was a pause on the other end. I could hear Serena processing the shift in my tone. She was suspicious by nature. All skilled manipulators are. They recognize the texture of a performance because they live inside one constantly. But ultimately, a narcissist cannot resist an audience, especially a skeptic who has finally come around. "I would love that," Serena said, her voice softening into something carefully warm. "Come this weekend, I'll show you everything." I drove to Portland on a Saturday morning. Harmony Wellness occupied the ground floor of a beautifully renovated Victorian building in a wealthy, tree-lined neighborhood. The exterior was painted a soft sage green. The window lettering was done in elegant gold. Through the glass, I could see a reception area furnished with cream-colored linen chairs, potted orchids, and soft, diffused lighting. It looked expensive, serene, and deeply trustworthy. It was designed to look that way. That was the entire point. Serena met me at the door. She was wearing a flowing, cream-colored medical tunic that somehow managed to look both clinical and fashionable. Her head was shaved, or more accurately, she was maintaining the shave. I noticed later that there was a light stubble of new growth at her temples that she had been carefully trimming. She gave me a long hug. She smelled like an expensive, essential oil blend. "I'm so glad you're here," she murmured into my shoulder. I hugged her back and said nothing. She gave me the full tour. The treatment rooms were individually designed. Each one a slightly different palette of calming neutrals, each one with a reclining treatment chair, an IV stand, and a small flat-screen monitor displaying slow-moving nature footage. The waiting area had a hospitality station with expensive herbal teas and alkaline water. There was a consultation library lined with books about integrative medicine, cellular health, and nutritional oncology. Everything was immaculate. Everything was designed to inspire trust. "We have 14 regular clients right now," Serena told me proudly, leading me into her private office at the back. 3 of them came to us after being told by their conventional oncologists that their tumors were inoperable. 2 of them are already reporting measurable improvements in their energy and their inflammatory markers. I made a note of this in a small notebook I was carrying, disguised as a personal journal. Improvements in inflammatory markers was a legally significant phrase. It implied that the clinic was measuring, tracking, and claiming medical outcomes, which is illegal for a wellness center operating without a medical license. "Can I see your client files?" I asked, keeping my voice casual and admiring. "I'm just trying to understand the scope of what you're doing." "It's genuinely impressive, Serena." She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she smiled. "Of course." She pulled up a client management system on her desktop. She clicked through a few anonymized intake forms, showing me the general structure: personal health history, current diagnosis, treatment goals, consent forms. The consent forms were a particularly devastating piece of evidence. They were carefully worded to disclaim any guarantee of medical results, which is standard practice for wellness businesses. But the intake forms directly above them asked clients to list their current cancer diagnoses and describe their conventional treatment failures. This was not a wellness center. It was a medical facility operating without a medical license, specifically targeting cancer patients as its customer base. I photographed everything I could without arousing suspicion, using the camera function on my phone while pretending to read the text on her screen. Then I did the one thing I had come specifically to do. "Serena," I said, turning to look at her with an expression of genuine concern. "Your own records, your own treatment history. I want to understand what you went through, not to pry, just because I wasn't there for you when I should have been. I want to see your journey." Serena's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a very slight tightening around her eyes. "Most of my personal records are at my previous care facility," she said smoothly. "I'm having them transferred." "Of course," I nodded. "Which facility was that? I'd love to send a note to your oncologist to thank him for taking care of you." "Dr. Holloway," she said. "He's semi-retired now. Hard to reach. That's okay," I said, smiling gently. "I'll figure it out. I just want to do something to show my appreciation." She looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. Something in Serena's eyes changed. The warmth didn't disappear, but behind it, I saw something calculating click into motion. She was an actress. She recognized a performance, and she had just registered on a deep, instinctual level that mine was not entirely genuine. I drove home that Sunday with pages of notes and photographs. I was 2 weeks away from finalizing the evidence package for the FBI. Serena moved faster than I expected. On Tuesday morning, my mother called me, sobbing. "Maya," my mother said, her voice breaking. "Serena is in the hospital. She collapsed at the clinic yesterday afternoon. She's in the ICU." The clinical part of my brain immediately began evaluating the claim. A GoFundMe collapse had raised $400,000. A well-timed hospital admission would be the perfect emotional circuit breaker to stop an investigation. It would force the family to rally around Serena, making it socially and emotionally impossible for me to continue building a case against a sister who was in the ICU, but I also couldn't ignore the possibility that she had actually collapsed. Stress, dehydration, a panic attack from the anxiety of being investigated. These could all produce a genuine medical episode. I flew home. Serena was in a private room at a regional hospital, not the ICU. She was sitting up in bed, watching television, with an IV running saline into her arm. She looked pale and tired, but not critically ill. When I walked in, she immediately muted the television and arranged her face into an expression of exhausted suffering. "Maya," she said quietly, "you came." "Of course I came," I said, sitting in the chair beside her bed. I looked at the monitors. Her heart rate was 62. Her oxygen saturation was 98%. These were the numbers of a resting, healthy adult. "What happened?" I asked. "My white cell count dropped," she said. "The doctor said my body is fighting hard. The leukemia is putting a lot of stress on my system." I picked up the chart clipped to the foot of her bed. This is something most visitors don't do, because most visitors are not federal investigators who can read medical charts fluently. The admission diagnosis was listed as syncopal episode, cause under investigation, which means she had fainted, and they hadn't found a specific cause yet. There was no mention of leukemia. There was no oncology consult noted in the chart. The attending physician's name was Dr. Claire Nguyen, a general internist, not an oncologist. There was a notation in the nursing notes. Patient states history of stage 3 AML, currently under care of Dr. R. Holloway. Unable to verify treating physician via NPI registry. Family physician records requested. The hospital was already trying to verify Dr. Holloway's existence and failing. The same wall I had hit. "The doctors here are being very thorough," Serena said, watching me put the chart back. Her eyes were sharp, underneath the performance of exhaustion. "They're asking a lot of questions about my previous care. It's very stressful, Maya. All these people doubting me, questioning my diagnosis. It makes it so much harder to heal." She let that sentence sit in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She wasn't talking about the hospital doctors. She was talking about me. She knew. She was telling me she knew. But she was wrapping it in the language of a sick woman being doubted, which is the most socially weaponized position a person can occupy. That evening, my father called me into the hospital cafeteria. He sat across from me with his coffee and his grief, and he said words that were clearly scripted by Serena. "I know you're a skeptical person, Maya. It's your job to be skeptical, but your sister is dying. Whatever professional instincts are firing in your head right now, I need you to turn them off. She needs us. She needs you. Please, be her sister." I looked at my father. He was a good man who had given $30,000 of his retirement to save his daughter's life. He was going to be devastated when this was over. "I love her, Dad," I said, and it was true. In a complicated, exhausted, grief-soaked way, it was entirely true. I just also knew she had never been sick a day in her life. When Serena was discharged 2 days later, our mother and 2 aunts organized a round-the-clock care schedule at Serena's apartment. I was assigned Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I showed up. I made soup. I sat on the couch and watched movies with her. And every Tuesday and Thursday night, I went home and worked until 2 a.m., adding new sections to the federal evidence package. Serena thought she had bought herself time. She thought the hospital episode had successfully reasserted her victim status, neutralized the threat, and surrounded herself with a human shield of grieving family members. She didn't understand that I had 11 years of experience building cases against people who were absolutely certain they had gotten away with it. She didn't understand that the hospital's failed attempt to verify Dr. Holloway's credentials had been automatically flagged in the state medical board's monitoring system, where it was now sitting in a queue as an unresolved physician verification failure. She didn't understand that, on the Monday she was admitted to the hospital, Dr. Park had finalized his forensic pharmaceutical analysis and sent me the completed report via encrypted federal email. She didn't understand that the only thing still standing between her and a federal indictment was one final document. I needed a voluntary health disclosure. I needed Serena, of her own free will and in her own words, to describe her medical history in a context where her statements would constitute official representations. I knew exactly how to get it, and I was going to use her own greed to do it. Serena's greatest weakness was the same as every fraudster I had ever investigated. She was too greedy to stop. A smarter criminal, sensing that someone was circling, would have quietly wound down the operation. They would have refunded a few clients, closed the business, and disappeared before the net closed. They would have accepted a smaller victory and protected their freedom. But Serena had spent 2 years building Harmony Wellness into a revenue machine. She had 14 high-paying clients. She had a waiting list. She had a social media presence with 30,000 followers who regarded her as a brave, innovative healing pioneer. She could not stop. Stopping would mean admitting the lie. I used that compulsion against her. 2 weeks after the hospital episode, I called Serena and told her I had a contact, a private wellness investment group that was looking to fund expansion of promising alternative health businesses. I told her I had mentioned Harmony Wellness and that they were interested in a preliminary conversation. I told her they would want a full business overview, including her personal health journey as the founder, since it was the foundation of the brand's credibility. Her response was immediate and electric. "Tell me everything," she breathed. "What do they need? What format? Can you get me a meeting?" I told her I would handle the introduction. I told her to prepare a full founder's presentation, financial projections, client outcomes, and a complete narrative of her personal medical journey and recovery presented as a formal business pitch. What I didn't tell her was that the investment group was a fabrication, and that when she made that presentation, she would be making it to 2 FBI agents and a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office who had already reviewed my evidence package and were waiting for one final piece: a recorded, voluntary, detailed description of the fraudulent medical history in a business context. In federal fraud law, when a person makes false statements to obtain financial investment, those statements constitute additional counts of wire fraud and securities fraud. Every word Serena said in that meeting would be evidence. Every claim about her cancer journey and her recovery would be a documented lie made in the presence of federal witnesses. I had built the cage. I just needed Serena to walk in. She spent 10 days preparing her pitch. She texted me updates excitedly. She hired a graphic designer to create a professional presentation deck. She wrote a detailed founder narrative that I quietly forwarded to the FBI case agent assigned to the file. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at a downtown hotel conference room. I told Serena to arrive at 9 a.m. and that I would meet her there. I arrived at 8:30. The 2 FBI agents, Special Agent Torres and Special Agent Kim, were already in position. The U.S. Attorney's Office prosecutor, a methodical woman named Reyes, sat at the end of the conference table with a neat stack of folders. A court-authorized recording device was embedded in the table's centerpiece, a simple arrangement of white flowers. Torres looked at me as I took my seat. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. At 9:02, Serena walked into the conference room. She was dressed beautifully. A tailored dove gray blazer over a silk blouse. Her shaved head was carefully polished under the conference room lights. She was carrying a leather portfolio containing her presentation. She looked at the faces in the room. She looked at me. She looked at Torres and Kim, who were wearing business attire rather than badges. She frowned slightly. "Maya, I thought you said this was the investment group?" "Sit down, Serena," I said quietly. She looked at me again, more carefully. The performer's instinct in her, the same instinct that had recognized my performance during the clinic visit, fired immediately. Her eyes swept the room. She noted the water glasses, the folders, the total stillness of the people around the table. She looked down at the flower centerpiece and then looked very quickly away. She knew. She knew instantly, with the certainty of a cornered animal. She took a single step backward toward the door. Special Agent Torres stood up and placed his badge on the table. "Miss Serena Rossi, I'm Special Agent Torres. FBI, please sit down. We'd like to speak with you." Serena's leather portfolio dropped from her hands. It hit the floor and slid under the conference table, scattering her carefully designed presentation slides across the carpet. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not the manufactured suffering she wore at the hospital. It was not the bright, practiced warmth of the clinic tour. It was pure, unfiltered, authentic shock. For the first time in as long as I could remember, Serena's face was completely honest. "You," she whispered. The word was a statement, not a question. "Sit down, Serena," I said again. My voice was gentle, but absolutely steady. She sat. Torres explained her rights. Reyes placed a copy of the federal complaint on the table in front of her. It was 37 pages long. Serena looked at the first page. She looked at the case number, the federal court header, and the list of charges. Wire fraud, federal healthcare fraud, operating a fraudulent medical practice without a license, money laundering, false statements to obtain charitable donations. The charges ran to 17 counts. At maximum sentencing, she was looking at a cumulative exposure of over 200 years in federal prison. Serena did not cry. She did not scream. She sat very still, with her hands flat on the conference table, and stared at the document. The performance had dropped completely. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been running for a very long time and had finally reached the end of the road. She asked for a lawyer. Torres nodded and immediately stopped all questioning. While Serena was on the phone in the hallway with a public defender, I walked to the window and looked out at the street below. I heard the radio crackle on Torres's belt. "Unit 7 to Torres," the radio said. "We are on site at Harmony Wellness, ready to execute search warrant on your signal." Torres looked at me. I nodded once. "Executu," Torres said into the radio. At that exact moment, while Serena stood in the hallway, 30 feet away, asking a lawyer how much trouble she was in, 8 FBI agents in plain clothes walked through the glass doors of Harmony Wellness. They presented the building manager with a federal search warrant, shut the clinic, and began the systematic seizure of all computers, financial records, client files, inventory, and the supply of injectable compounds from the treatment rooms. A client who had arrived for her morning appointment, a woman in her late 50s wearing a headscarf, was gently redirected by an agent who told her the clinic was temporarily closed for a regulatory inspection. The woman looked confused and frightened as she walked back to her car. That moment, that specific woman walking back to her car, carrying her illness and her desperate hope in the set of her shoulders, was the moment that the last of my professional distance finally failed. I turned away from the window before the tears could make it to my eyes. I pressed them down hard, using the mechanical discipline of 11 years of this work. I reminded myself of the $47 saline injections. I reminded myself of the $30,000 of my parents' retirement savings. I reminded myself of every single person on that GoFundMe donor list who had opened their heart to a story about a dying woman who had never been sick a day in her life. By the time Serena came back into the conference room with her public defender, my eyes were dry and my face was calm. She sat across from me at the table. Her public defender murmured something in her ear. Serena nodded, then looked at me with an expression that was exhausted and bewildered and searching all at once. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, but she ignored it. "Since the first phone call," I replied. The NPI number was missing from Holloway's letter. Serena stared at me. She looked as though she was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. "You were making soup," she said, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "You were sitting on my couch watching movies with me." "Yes," I said simply. "You were building the case the whole time." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. The conference room was very still. "I thought the hospital would stop you," she said finally. "I know," I replied. One of Serena's presentation slides had come to rest near my chair when it fell from her portfolio. I looked down at it. It was the opening slide of her pitch deck. It showed a professionally photographed image of her at the Harmony Wellness reception desk, smiling, the sage green walls and the orchids perfect behind her. Across the top, in elegant serif font, it read, "Healing from the Inside Out, a Founder's Journey." I left the slide on the floor. I gathered my files and my laptop and stood up. "I'll give you some time," I said to Serena. I walked out of the conference room, down the elevator, and out through the hotel lobby into the morning air. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, my briefcase at my side, the sun on my face. Somewhere across the city, FBI agents were loading Harmony Wellness's inventory into evidence vans. 14 clients were receiving phone calls from a victim notification specialist, informing them that the clinic was under federal investigation and that their treatment records were now part of an evidence file. The trap was complete. The case was no longer mine. It belonged to the federal prosecutors now. I had done my job. I walked to my car, put my briefcase in the trunk, and drove to a diner 3 blocks away. I ordered black coffee and a plate of eggs I didn't eat. I sat in the corner booth for 2 hours, watching the street outside the window, until the professional silence in my head began, very slowly, to fill with something else. Something that felt like the complicated, heavy, grief-soaked love of a younger sister who had just sent her older sister to federal prison. It did not feel like winning. It just felt like the only thing I could have done. The federal prosecution of Serena Rossi moved with the methodical, grinding speed of the United States justice system. The evidence package I had built was essentially complete before the arrest. The FBI's forensic accounting team spent 3 months expanding the financial investigation, tracing every dollar from GoFundMe through Serena's personal accounts and into the Harmony Wellness operating budget. They identified 14 additional victims, Harmony's wellness clients, who had paid for the injectable compounds, believing they were receiving legitimate oncological support. The total documented fraud exceeded $1.2 million. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed a superseding indictment 3 months after the arrest. The final charge count was 23 federal counts, 16 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of healthcare fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, and 1 count of operating an unlicensed medical practice. Serena's public defender was replaced by a private attorney funded by a loan from our parents, the same parents who had given her $30,000 of retirement savings to fight the cancer she had never had. I did not comment on this. It was not my place. The trial lasted 11 days. I was called as a witness for the prosecution. I testified for 6 hours across 2 days, walking the jury through the investigation methodology, the NPI database searches, the insurance record analysis, the forensic pharmaceutical report, and the financial audit trail. I had testified in federal court dozens of times. I was a calm, precise, methodical witness. I answered every question exactly as asked, neither more nor less. I did not look at Serena during my testimony. I looked at the jury, the prosecutor, the evidence exhibits, and the middle distance. In my peripheral vision, I was aware of her presence at the defense table, the tailored suit she was wearing, the careful stillness she had adopted in the courtroom. She was performing again. The performance of a woman wrongly accused. It didn't work this time. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 23 counts. At sentencing, the federal judge noted the particularly egregious nature of the crimes, specifically the deliberate targeting of terminally ill and medically desperate patients as revenue sources. He noted the emotional and financial harm caused to GoFundMe donors, many of whom had given money they could not afford because they believed a lie. He noted the $30,000 stolen from our elderly parents. He sentenced Serena to 14 years in federal prison, with no possibility of early release for the first 8 years. She was also ordered to pay restitution of $1.4 million. The full estimated value of the fraud, plus legal costs. When the judge read the sentence, Serena sat completely still at the defense table. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat very still, her hands folded, her face composed. Then she turned and looked at me. I had been sitting in the gallery, behind the prosecution table. When she turned, I met her eyes. We looked at each other across the crowded courtroom for a moment that felt much longer than it was. I don't know what she was looking for. I don't know if she found it. She was led out of the courtroom by 2 federal marshals. The door closed behind her. I gathered my bag and walked out. The aftermath was quieter and more painful than the case itself. Harmony Wellness's client files were handed over to a victim support organization specializing in medical fraud. A licensed oncology nurse was brought in to review each client's situation and help them find legitimate care pathways. Several of the clients had delayed or abandoned conventional treatment in favor of Harmony Wellness's protocols. For 2 of them, the delay had been significant enough to affect their prognosis. This is the fact I carry with me every single day. Not the conviction, not the sentence, not the $1.4 million in restitution that Serena will never fully pay. The fact that 2 sick people, 2 people who had already been abandoned by their own bodies, trusted a lie, and lost time they could not afford to lose. They will carry the consequences of my sister's greed for the rest of their lives. I carry a version of that too. Not the guilt of someone who did wrong, but the weight of someone who could have moved faster. Every week, I didn't hand the file to the FBI while I was building the case more thoroughly, while I was waiting for the perfect evidentiary moment, was a week those clients sat in a cream-colored reclining chair and received a $47 injection they believed was saving their lives. I have thought about this calculation often. The more thorough the evidence, the stronger the conviction, and the stronger the conviction, the less chance Serena had to plea down to a lighter sentence and emerge in 5 years to do this again in a different state, under a different name. Thoroughness served the long-term interests of every future victim. I believe this, but I also know that it is, in part, a story I tell myself at 2 a.m. My parents did not speak to me for 3 months after the verdict. My mother felt that I had destroyed the family. My father felt that I had been given a choice between loyalty and law and had chosen law. He was not wrong. That is exactly the choice I made. They came back eventually, slowly. My father called me first, on a Sunday afternoon. He didn't apologize, and neither did I. We just talked about other things for 40 minutes, and then he said he would call next week. And he did. My mother took longer. When she finally came around, she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "I know what Serena did was wrong. I know it. But I needed someone to be angry at, and you were the one standing there." I told her I understood. I did. As for my own life after the case, the professional rewards were significant and immediate. The Rossi case, as it came to be called internally, was cited in 3 subsequent federal prosecutions of fraudulent wellness businesses as a methodological template. My evidence-building framework was adopted as a training module for new investigators in our regional office. I was promoted to supervisory investigator. I have a team of 6 people now. We run an average of 14 active cases at any given time. I tell my team the same thing every time we open a new case involving a sympathetic defendant. I tell them what I told myself sitting in that diner, staring at my untouched eggs, the morning the FBI raided Harmony Wellness. The job is not to decide who deserves mercy. The job is to follow the evidence, document the truth, and hand it to the people whose job it is to dispense justice. Your feelings about the outcome are your own problem. Do not let them contaminate the file. I know there are people who will judge me for what I did. They will say that I had other options. They will argue that I could have confronted Serena privately, given her a chance to shut down the clinic and repay the donors, and avoided sending my own sister to federal prison for 14 years. They will say that blood is thicker than a badge, and that a good person would have found a way to protect both her family and the truth. Some people will even say that I waited too long, that I spent months building a meticulous case while sick people sat in that clinic receiving expensive salt water, and that my thoroughness was, in some part, a kind of professional vanity. I have had all of these arguments with myself. I have lost some of them. But I will tell you what I have never been able to argue my way out of: the 14 clients who walked through the doors of Harmony Wellness, believed they were fighting for their lives. They were already scared. They had already been failed, or thought they had been failed, by the medical system. And my sister looked at their fear and saw an opportunity. She didn't hesitate. She built a beautiful room and filled it with orchids and soft light, and she charged them $8,000 a month for sugar water, and she told them they were healing. I don't know what the right thing to do was. I only know what I did. So I will leave the verdict up to you. If your sibling was running a fraudulent medical business that was stealing from desperate, dying patients, would you try to handle it quietly, within the family, and hope she stopped on her own? Or would you spend months building an airtight federal case, walk her into a room with the FBI, and watch the marshals take her away, knowing your parents might never fully forgive you for it? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every single one.